my absolute pleasure to announce the first speaker of today. Not only was he the first creator of the Cultivated meat burger in London back in 2013, but he's also the founder and chief scientific officer at Mosa Meat, one of the first companies aiming to get cultivated meat on market. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Mark Post.
Thanks, Natalia, and welcome everybody. You already had some introduction into the why and how of cultivated meat. So I will go very quickly through these. You have seen the impact of the environment, and if you open the newspaper, at least in some European countries and others, you can find that each time references to what the impact of livestock agriculture is on the environment, and of course also on animal welfare and others in terms of land use, water use, energy use, greenhouse gas emission, and so forth, and of course antibiotics use. So why we should do something about this is relatively clear. So the process that we are employing, and I will give kind of a overview of what others are also doing. So it's not all the same. So we are taking a biopsy from an animal, just 0.5 gram of tissue through a needle. We isolate muscle cells and fat cells from that, or muscle and fat precursor cells, then we let them proliferate. And you already heard about growth factors and stuff, so that's essentially what you're using there, and medium, of course. And then we make tissues out of them. So we let the cells actually self-assemble into small organoids, if you like, and that eventually creates a tissue. It takes about 3 weeks, actually a little bit shorter, and you have to pull a couple of tricks to make those cells kind of align, find each other, and form a muscle structure. And we do the same for fat tissue, and then eventually you combine those small tissues into a hamburger. Mind you, the 2013 hamburger that was referred to didn't have any fat tissue, so we added that later on. I mentioned that some of the other research institutes or companies or universities do different things, and they also call it different things. So you know this slide, it starts with a muscle all the way up to the upper left. And then if you zoom in, you get muscle bundles, muscle fibers, and eventually a muscle cell, which is already a merger of a large number of cells. And muscle cells are very particular because they have this neatly arranged muscle proteins that allow them to contract. And so from a proteome perspective, it's quite an interesting kind of cell, because 75% of all the proteins are so-called structural proteins: actin, myosin, titin, tropomyosin, you name it, everything that's associated with the contractile element of the muscle cell. And then the other 25% are all the kind of supportive structures for cell function. So some people actually have gone to the very extreme and say, well, if 75% of the protein is actin and myosin and titin anyway, why don't we just make those proteins recombinantly and then mix them into something that looks like a hamburger, if it's otherwise plant-based or whatever. So you have the nutritional value, and perhaps you also have some of the function. So that's the sort of the protein-based approach, if you like. And then there is the cell-based approach, which you hear about a lot these days. These companies aim to differentiate or produce cells, animal cells, differentiate them or not differentiate them, and add them as an ingredient to a plant-based product. And then there is the fiber-based kind of approach, what I've been discussing, making organoids and making fat blobs, and then adding them together so that you can create a hamburger. And finally, there is a tissue-based approach. And you know that there is a couple of groups out there who immediately jump to the most complex part of this whole process, make an entire full thickness tissue. And that's quite an endeavor, which will take a little bit longer and requires additional technologies. So the process in the end looks on an industrial scale something like this. You start with a seed train, then you have small pieces of numbers of cells. You cryopreserve them until the time you need them. Then you cultivate them to larger numbers, and eventually you end up in these large bioreactors, 1,000 liters, or maybe 25,000 liters, or maybe 500,000 liters, who knows? We're not there yet, but eventually it can be scaled up to those large tanks. So a farm looks like a bundle of these steel tanks. In order to do that, to culture those mammalian cells in those tissue or in those bioreactors, you need to let them either form aggregates, or you need to grow them on microcarriers. And for sure, you can do that with bovine muscle precursors and bovine fat precursors. You can grow them on microcarriers. We've worked a lot on that. And then there are two kind of issues with it. One, they take up space, and second, you have to separate the microcarriers eventually from the cells. So, but it can be done, and it is being done right now, and you can actually make a first product that way. Of course, this relies heavily on multiplication of those precursor cells, and if you do that math, if you eventually end up with 50 doublings, which is possible theoretically, then from this very small sample, you can make a tremendous amount of meat, like 2 billion kilos of meat, which is a lot. We're not there yet. We're currently somewhere between 30 and 35 doublings, and that means that from this half a gram of sample, you get 2,000 kilos of meat. So the disadvantage of this system, that once in a while you have to go back to the animal to get some new cells. Now, if you translate that into what it would look like, for instance, a regular farm in the Netherlands would look like. So a farm in the Netherlands, this is already quite a big farm actually, 250 cows per farm, producing about 35 tons of meat per year. And if you do that math, you would have to replace that with 4 of those 1,000-liter tanks. So that doesn't seem to be, highly problematic. That's actually a reasonable kind of ratio. If you translate that to what the world production of beef, only beef, would be at this point, which is the lower kind of line, total world consumption 300 million tons per year and growing. And that would mean that you would roughly have to double and then some the total fermentation capacity that's currently available in the world. And that's just for beef. So that's quite an endeavor. If you think about that, which is that fermentation capacity, you may not know how big it is, but if you think about all the beer and wine that has to be fermented, it's actually quite a substantial volume that needs to be increased, but not undoable. One of the, of course, reasons why we're doing this is to reduce the impact on the environment. And there are a couple of reasons to believe that that's possible. First, animals, in particular cows, are extremely inefficient in converting their feed, all the amino acids and sugars that you put into the animals, or that they put themselves into themselves. Into muscle proteins. So we lose a lot of feedstock when we have the animal as intermediate. And that requires to produce a lot of feed with all the water and energy use and so forth, and agricultural land. But also because the cow actually ferments its food, it is associated with methane gas emission. And of course, cells are not fermenting them. They don't use bacteria to process the food. They actually get it kind of in a pre-formed way, of course, in the form of amino acids or sugars. I will come back to that later. And so that way you kind of avoid that fermentation effect of methane formation. And the third reason to believe that this will be more sustainable is that it's a contained system. So there's a lot of opportunity for recycling. Now, a couple of life cycle analyses have been done, as you are probably aware of. They're all anticipatory because the production system, apart from a very small production in Singapore, is not there yet. And you can only do these analyses properly if you have a production system in mind and actually in effect. So it's not there yet, it's all anticipatory. And they vary a little bit. They don't vary too much in saving of land use and water if you would switch from livestock agriculture to cultivated meat, but they do vary a lot in energy. So what a relatively recent study has done is they have compared kind of a total, they have assigned a total environmental score consisting of global warming capacity, land use, water consumption, fine particle matter, human toxicity, and others. That into one composite kind of environmental score, which apparently is not unusual. I'm not from this field, so I don't know. And then what we already knew from other studies is that beef, both dairy and beef, are pretty bad in terms of environmental score. Pork and chicken are a lot better. That's associated with that conversion ratio of their feed into proteins, which for chicken and pork is a lot better than for beef. And then, of course, all the way on the left, the vegetarian substitutes are actually the best. And they will always remain the best, there's no question. Going vegetarian or vegan from an environmental perspective will always be better than any cultivated meat solution or single protein solution for that matter. Now here are two bars for cultivated meat. Conventional cultivated meat, actually meaning that all the energy that's required for this process will be not green, will basically be the result of fossil fuel kind of combustion, or sustainable cultured meat where the energy will be from renewable sources. So they have kind of made that distinction. This is actually the first that made that explicitly, and to me it makes a lot of sense because not only because, of course, cultured meat comes better out of this comparison, but also because this is kind of a future endeavor, and I cannot envision that we will continue to use fossil fuels much longer for energy production. So this is zooming in on it again, what the different components are for that cultivated meat, and especially the energy consumption. So heat for production, electricity for production. So it's in the form of electricity, so therefore it's possible to actually use green energy for it. So that's fine, but you also, of course, need to produce a product that people want to eat, and that has. It was apparently already mentioned that you can also have other protein sources, and of course you can have vegetable protein sources. So why would you do this? What's the added value of making meat anyway? We don't necessarily need meat. There are 2 billion vegetarians on this planet. They have a fine life. So what's the added value? And that to me means that the product has to satisfy the craving or the need for people, for the 95% of the people who are not vegetarian, for meat. And that means that it has to have that function, that nutritional value, that taste, that chewing quality, that mouthfeel, all that kind of perception type of characteristics. So you would actually need to make muscle fibers, you need to make larger structures, you would need to have fat in there, and it's important to have a nutritional value that is very similar. I'm therefore not really a big believer in using cells as an ingredient in an otherwise plant-based product. So this is quite a boring slide. This is actually a minced meat that we bought from the supermarket, and this is protein content. This is just the crude protein content, and protein content wise, with our muscle fibers were actually on the same level as the muscle fibers that you get from a minced meat product in the supermarket. Now, this doesn't say anything about composition. Of course, we also have looked at composition, especially those structural proteins, actin and myosin. And this is actually very similar for the cultivated meat as for the regular meat. So protein-wise, we kind of look okay. It's not completely there yet, but it's quite good already, and it's actually getting better every month or so. Fat-wise, we were really curious whether this would pan out to be kind of a similar fat composition, because we had no idea essentially. And here on the right we have the fat straight coming from a cow, and on the left we have our cultivated fat. And the coded bars signify kind of the composition of fatty acids. The color coding is here, going from 16 chain length carbon atoms to 22 with different degrees of saturation. And then you can immediately see that that composition is actually quite similar to fat composition in the animal. This was a relief from a nutritional value and taste perspective. It was somewhat of a disappointment because we kind of hoped naively that maybe it would have more unsaturated fatty acids, so naturally it would be more healthy for you. Unfortunately, we cannot say that yet. So we have to do additional metabolic engineering to make that happen. Then people also need to eat it, and so there's a whole psychological factor around this. This is not immediately appetizing for people, and by now there are quite a number of surveys. There's not really a product comparison yet or tests in a supermarket because they're just not allowed. So it's all quite academic and theoretic. The one that came closest to actual feel for the product was the one that we did, and this is the study that we did here. We basically asked the question: does it matter what type of information you give to people in order for them to accept it? So we divided a cross-section of the Dutch population in 3 groups. Some got information about societal benefits, some about personal benefits, it's healthier for you or whatever, and some just about meat quality and taste. And then we asked questions of acceptance before and after we gave that information. And then we had them taste a piece of hamburger, actually 2 pieces of hamburger, one that was labeled as regular and one that was labeled as cultivated. In fact, they were both regular hamburgers, so they were actually cut from exactly the same hamburger. But the people believed and thought they had eaten a cultivated hamburger, and we had them make kind of sensory analysis comparison on the 2 pieces of meat. But in essence, the question was, does the amount of information, not the amount, but the quality of information that you give to the people, does that matter in terms of acceptance? And so here's the outcome. It's kind of interesting. Well, first of all, this was before the information, it was after the information and after tasting. And we asked questions, or are you in favor of this? Do you want to taste it? Do you want to buy it? Do you want to replace your current meat consumption with cultivated meat consumption? And then you see that even before we gave any information, the acceptance was already quite high. This is what we sometimes see, that 50% of the people kind of on a theoretical level accept this. You also see immediately that the quality of the information, the type of information that we gave really didn't matter, whether it was societal or personal benefits. And every marketeer will always tell you that people are only interested in personal benefits and never in societal benefits. But here we didn't really see that difference between the two. But what you do see is that every time you give information from before to after info, acceptance rises. So we see time and time again, if you give information, if you tell the story, acceptance actually increases. Interestingly, what's not on this slide, we had the people found the cultivated meat piece taste better than the regular meat. They all ate the cultivated meat without any hesitation. And they found that better tasting than the regular one, which is kind of what we already knew. If you put jerry can wine in a very expensive bottle, it tastes a lot better. All right. So there were a couple of surveys. I glanced through it. Surveys throughout the world, actually, and it's kind of a similar kind of acceptance level by the 50% or so, which is quite remarkable for a product that doesn't exist yet. So yeah, when is this going to happen? I'm not at liberty to say too much about it because it's all somewhat speculative. You already know probably that in December last year, the first product was approved in Singapore, which is a big deal. I'm not a particular fan of that particular product, but it's a big deal that it was approved because that means that large-scale produced cell products added to a food can be considered safe, which we already knew, but it's good that regulatory officials see the same. So this is kind of what a market analyst projects over the next 50 years, that eventually conventional meat consumption will go down at the expense of, or sorry, at the and then plant-based and cultivated meat will go up, and they kind of predict that plant-based will eventually reach a plateau in terms of market share, which I think is reasonable to assume, although I hope, to be honest, that plant-based will increase because it's always, from an environmental perspective, better. That first product that we made was, so all these market projections are nice. I don't know how solid they are, but of course they are predicated on the fact that the quality of the meat has to be good and the price has to be low, because people are not going to spend a whole lot more money. Currently, it's very expensive, and that's mostly because the medium components, the feed components, are expensive. And you heard already about, making growth factors more efficient and so forth. So everybody is working on that, and currently growth factors are a substantial part of the price. But eventually those will go down. There's no question that they will go down. It's absolutely unreasonable that they're high at the moment. And eventually it will come down. Can we get those original feedstocks, those proteins, those amino acids, those sugars, can we get them cheap enough so that you can actually make the medium cheap? Oops, this is going to be a little bit fast. One of the things that I'm particularly passionate about is the possibility for recycling. Here we looked at amino acid expenditure by the cells over time, over a 7-day period. And you see that it varies. On the left are the essential amino acids, on the right, the non-essential amino acids. And even after 7 days, a lot of amino acids are still present in that medium, and yet we throw it away. So we have to find smarter ways to do that. And we are currently getting actually quite far with that. This is another interesting example where, remember that slide where I showed the peas and the sugar beets. We actually took those peas and those sugar beets and wheat and a couple of other proteins, hydrolyzed those proteins to smaller fractions, but not single amino acids, not highly purified, and threw them on the medium instead of amino acids. And here, I apologize, it's anonymized, but some of those hydrolysates actually, like at pH 6 here and some pH 5 hydrolysates, work actually quite well as amino acid replacers. So these are basically crude hydrolysates taken from produce from the field and threw them in the mix of the medium. So I think this eventually is the way to go. You probably have seen this slide already. The whole industry is quite rapidly growing, to my big delight. And this slide has to be updated pretty much every month or so. Investments in the area are also growing. They're not as big as in plant-based yet, but they are also growing quite rapidly. And some of those companies are now at a stage where they can start to make pilot factories and get through regulatory approval. They all have to go through regulatory approval in Europe. This is EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority. We are not using GMO because in Europe it's really a no-go from a consumer acceptance perspective, but others may be using GMO, and then it becomes a little bit more complex. And I want to end with this one because this is kind of the newest data around on the regulatory approval up till December last year. No product was approved nowhere. Singapore is extremely active in getting this stuff approved because by 2030 they want to produce 30% of their own food. So they have approved the product of Eat Just, which is a chicken nugget, essentially cells added as an ingredient to a mostly plant-based product. But the fact of the matter is it's approved, and that's a great step forward. So with that, and also in view of the time, I would like to end, and I'm happy to entertain questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us here, Professor Post. So my question is, at Mosa you have quite a lot of different teams working on this project. Could you perhaps speak a little bit about what teams other than the Vat Lab and the cell biologists are working on, for instance, computational and so forth teams?
Right, so we have 7 teams, and 2 of them are not exactly kind of wet lab. It's a science computing team, as you mentioned, and there's also an automation team. So in order to, we have chosen to do a lot of the engineering for making bioreactors, tissue bioreactors, but also filters, other applications, automation of pipetting activities, all that sort of stuff, to do that mostly in-house. That's kind of historically grown because the engineer who leads that was employee number 1, I believe, or 3. And we found it a very good system to have very rapid iterations of prototypes of equipment that we will need and testing of that equipment. So that was, in our case, extremely helpful. The science computing team is essentially has a couple of elements. It has a computational element in modeling, for instance, fluid dynamics in bioreactors. It has a data analysis, a bioinformatics element where all these teams are gathering a lot of data, image data, cell counts data, all sorts of other data. And we eventually want to combine them in a model where all the variables are put in, and we can find relations between those variables so that we can reduce the number of experiments. And we do a lot of bioinformatics to understand what is happening in those cells when you cultivate them, when they age, what happens, and whether we can kind of postpone that, or when they form tissue. So that's essentially what the science computing team is doing.
So we have some questions from the chat. Different cultures prefer a different quality of meat, such as age of the animal and hormonal content. Does this method take hormonal content into account?
No, it doesn't. We do currently very systematic research of the relation of age of the animal and the quality of the cells that we get. We do very systematic research of what place of the animal we get the cells from, and on the gender of the animal. The animals are all from the same herd, so they all get the same feed, which is actually grown on the farm itself. They have very little added feed to it. And they use regular practices in the Netherlands. So growth hormones are forbidden in the Netherlands. Antibiotics prophylactically are forbidden in the Netherlands. So they don't have either of those. I'm not sure what was meant by hormonal. Maybe it was, whether we take into account whether the female cows are in where they are in their cycle. We don't. And I think it's actually better not to, because you want to make this system very robust and not be dependent on too many variables.
Unfortunately, we have time for only one last question from the chat. Hey, Mark, how do you feel about the new feedstock from Solar Foods?
Yeah, it's a great idea. Currently, of course, it's still limited, and it will take some time to make that cost effective. There are all sorts of even more radical kind of approaches, up to artificial, artificial chlorophyll kind of reactions, creating energy components, using the sun in an even more efficient way to create energy components, and of course the solar food. If energy really becomes as abundant as we think it will, then solar foods definitely is an option. So far, it's still, it's still a little bit farther away. And I think that if you can increase that efficiency of a cow from 15% efficiency in food conversion to, let's say, 60 or 70%, you already can free up a tremendous amount of land that you don't need to use anymore for agriculture. So I'm not sure in the end if we need that. Agriculture, plant-based agriculture is already quite sufficient to feed the planet if we can get rid of food waste and get rid of the inefficiency of livestock agriculture.
We have so many interesting questions in the chat, but unfortunately we will not have time to address them. Please, everyone, if you have more questions, you can address Mr. Post directly via email at some other point. But right now we need to continue with our schedule.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you so much, Mr. Post. As I said, it's a true pleasure to have you here today, and thank you for your insights into the industry.